Brun?
Yep, fine.
What's the name?
Methadone, morphine, fentanyl, oxycodone, tramadol, pethidine, codeine, DHC, gabapentin, pregabalin, temazepam, clonazepam, lorazepam, pregabalin, amitriptyline, nortriptyline, quetiapine, venlafaxine. These are all the medicines my wife tried, and they kind of worked in some cases. They weren't sustainable long term, and after 5 years of putting up with it, we chose another option. And as a slightly conservative person myself, activism was a swear word. So here we have a charity, Medical Cannabis Awareness New Zealand, and we've been trying to advocate for patients within the law, and we have some unique insights on how things actually work at the moment and where the problems are and where the bill falls over. So first off, with the latest bill, there's really issues in how it was drafted, and there was no external consultation, and it was run to a 100-day time limit, and it seemed most of the parts of the bill were quite meaningless. From the patient perspective, I'm quite plugged in with who's getting busted by the police, and it's not terminal patients. There's no one who's 2 months from death's door that has the police knocking on their door. So that whole part of the bill was actually toothless. So we would argue that it is extended to those with severe or debilitating conditions, and that is because that's what is happening with the police. Is people that are severe, that aren't terminal, are being raided by the police. The police tend to look away from people consuming. However, if you're a sick person and you cultivate for yourself to ensure you don't have to deal with organised crime and gangs and that sort of thing, if you take the supply of your own medicine into your own hands, the police come down and you'll get toe bricks. So even if you're not for people growing at home, you have to ask yourself as a society, are we happy with really sick people to be hauled before the courts for growing something that helps them? Especially when the legal options cost thousands of dollars a month. A mutual friend of ours, Huhana Hickey, as you may know, spent tens of thousands of dollars being legal. She's in a Housing New Zealand house, so she can't grow because she'd get kicked out of the house even if the courts let her off. So that's why in our recommendations when we looked at this, we thought severe and debilitating. It's not a big stretch when the non-pharmaceutical application scheme that the Ministry of Health has, in their criteria, the first criteria is severe or life-threatening. So it's very similar language. If it's good enough for the ministry and the prescribers, it's good enough for the courts and the doctors. The Americans, in many of their states, they use the term severe or debilitating, so it's common terminology over there. It is a bit loose, and with chronic pain, you can argue at the very edges of it, is your pain severe enough? I can understand David Clark trying to scrap chronic pain as a promise, because it talks about grandma with a little bit of arthritis in one joint who uses paracetamol. That's still chronic pain if it lasts for 3 months or longer. But when we speak about the severity of the condition, it doesn't cover all the people that are on their last legs who've exhausted all of these other horrific medications. So severe or debilitating, we think because of the issues with sick people and poor people not being able to grow because they're in rentals and that sort of thing, that it should be extended to a family member or a caregiver if the police are satisfied that their cultivation is only for that sick person that they know, that the police should be able to use their discretion and not prosecute in those cases. On the other side of the bill, we talk about descheduling cannabidiol, and there's a raft of other chemicals that should be descheduled. If you don't deschedule it now, it's going to be a game of whack-a-mole in 3 or 4 years' time back at Select Committee descheduling some of the others. So cannabidiol, which is CBDV, that is being commercially developed and researched for epilepsy by GW Pharma. That is very similar to CBD, and that should be descheduled too. Cannabidiol is another one that's being trialled for eczema and psoriasis. Cannabiglycol is another one that is starting to be developed into isolated products in the States, but there's not much research. But it suggests in the preclinical that it might be very good for chronic pain, and they're making it into skin patches, non-psychoactive. So we think if you're going to look at CBD, take the time to look at some of the other compounds, because if you don't do it now, it's going to be a gross waste of resources later to deschedule those products too. Now on the regulations side, Annex A, which is our policy booklet that you probably all received in late January, we think we already have a solution. We've looked at what's working internationally, and we have some really big questions with this regulations that we don't know what is in them. So the big question is, do we want to give permits for patients to go nuts and get whatever products they want, or do we want to stick down the prescribed product route where you're prescribing a balanced THC to CBD ratio? and that sort of thing. So we looked at Canada, and we feel that they're the most successful. Their products are not pharmaceutical standard by law, but they are very near to it. So Dr. Reddy, you talked in your speech about the near pharmaceuticals. Those products over there are called GPP as their standard, but we call it near pharmaceutical. So their products are actually transitioning to pharmaceutical as the companies are around longer. So for example, the Canadian company Tilray, their first few applications were non-pharmaceutical. However, their next batch of products coming into New Zealand has made the transition to pharmaceutical grade. The product hasn't magically changed, it's just a bit of paperwork. But they set up their regulatory regime so the companies could get set up with lower standard products now that doctors can still trust. And then further down the track, as when it's in the business's interests, when they want to go to export, that they are self-incentivized to take that step to pharmaceutical grade. The other issue with Canada though is patients are allowed to grow their own, and doctors don't want to have a bar of that. So we propose in our policy that if we're going to have a licensing agency to set up a big commercial production, then perhaps it should be able to review individual patients on a case-by-case basis to license them to grow for themselves. So there'll be criteria involved in that, especially around diversion. I don't think we want to be giving permits to patch gang members. But at the same time, if someone's got MS, and we all know cannabis works for MS, there's a whole bunch of phase 3 clinical trials, despite what some other people will say. For someone with MS, we have efficacy that it works. Perhaps they've been on this product for 6 months and the doctor signs off on it and they can't afford it. So the Ministry of Health themselves could perhaps sign off on an individual patient for a limited amount of growth. As I discussed earlier, we talked about limits, and pre-election, some of the political parties were talking about plant counts. And you can grow plants so big that you need a chainsaw to cut them down. So plant counts are not the way to go. If you're going to set standards, you set it on area because you can only grow so much plant in that area. So the other thing is, when we talk about these product standards, it has a direct bearing on cost. So in our Annex B here, we've got a nice visual slide view wall of where we're at the moment, where Sativex is about 75 cents a milligram. Tilray, which is that near pharmaceutical that's now making the transition to pharmaceutical, that's about 60 cents a milligram. There's another product that I've had approved that we're waiting to come in, that's down to 40 cents a milligram. Now, if we were to switch that to domestic production here and looking at what the Canadians actually pay for their products versus what we do, we could get it down to 25 cents a milligram for these near pharmaceuticals. So that's at less than a third of what people are currently paying. But even then, that is still too much for patients. So we're talking down to $100 a week. If you're on a sickness benefit, that's too much. So another thing we've proposed that no one else has really looked at is we need a funding scheme for medical cannabis for those patients where it does work. If we talk about epilepsy, I'm going to get into the really, really heavy stuff here. About 15 milligrams per kilo body weight is the average dose for an epileptic kid in Australia of pure CBD.
Sorry, could you say that again?
15 milligrams per kilo of body weight. So for a 50 kg teen, we could be talking 700 milligrams a day, and at 25, 30 cents a milligram, you're talking hundreds of dollars a day. These patients, no one's talked about the epileptic kids, and that's because they can't afford it. And they've got legal access now. Starship's now prepared to apply for a handful of patients, but they can't do that ethically until funding is sorted. So what we've proposed is similar to the Pharmax PPA scheme, is that there's a separate fund for those patients. Now, bearing in mind we're in tight fiscal times, we would propose that these licensed producers at the commercial end that the government is setting up, all of the tax revenues that the government collects from that, that should all be earmarked for funding for patients, so that the epileptic kids can actually have a chance at trying CBD to see if it works for them. Because no which way since Sunday, anything in the regulations at the moment is actually going to help the people who need it the most. I'd also like to touch on evidence. There is a lot of evidence, but most of it is in the phase 1 to 2 level. So on our new graphic that we've sent through to you, we've got a nice handy slide explaining the phases of research. So phase 3, which is the gold standard, random, placebo, randomly controlled trials, they are what we call woodwork or clinical certainty. So when organisations say that there's no evidence, what they're really saying is that there's no phase 3s to their satisfaction. There's plenty of phase 2s for a whole lot of things. And the preclinical stuff, the amount of conditions that are being treated are astounding. I met with the CEO of one of the Canadian companies. They have 22,000 patients on their books, and they service 168 conditions. Nearly 60% of those patients are for chronic pain disorders. Nearly 20% are for neurological disorders like epilepsy and motor neuron disease. But only 10% were actually for cancer or oncological disorders or problems. So this this bill and talking about terminal conditions, specifically, meaning cancer, is really only servicing 10% of the market. So we've got a lot of work to do there. And I'd just like to highlight where this research is going, because you're going to hear a lot of negatives on the research from some of the official bodies. This time here was written by an American organisation, the National Academy of Sciences. 10,000 articles went into the review. And their view was that there is substantial evidence that cannabis is effective for the treatment of chronic pain in adults. The Faculty of Pain Medicine for Australia and New Zealand says, with the possible exception of pain and spasticity in MS, there is little evidence for the effectiveness of cannabinoids in chronic non-cancer pain situations, whether or not that pain attracts the descriptor of neuropathic. So we've got these really big disparities between what the literature says when you actually amalgamate it all and do a decent bit of research versus what some of the medical specialists say, particularly the pain specialists. Our experience being a guerrilla med safe, as David Seymour called it, trying to get non-pharmaceutical products approved, is that neurologists are more on board than other fields. So they're using it for MS, they're starting to use it for epilepsy. They even went out on their limb and tried it for Tourette syndrome. And for severe Tourette syndrome in New Zealand, the clinical success rate is 100%. Yet there's no phase 3 clinical trial behind it. So we really think that GPs should be able to prescribe it as they see fit. And those GPs that are squeamish about it, we think that we need a medical specialty for specialists who are up to the play with the different types of cannabis and the strains and the different effects. So that your average GP who might have a chronic pain patient who's stuck on methadone, they might go, cannabis is right for you, but I don't know much about it. I want to send you to Dr. G, he knows all about it. He'll find out, sort you out what's balanced for you and what works. And then in 3 weeks' time, you come back to me and I'll fill out the repeats. That already happens for other medicines. In my personal situation, my wife's on methadone. And in Canada, methadone is a 4th line treatment for chronic neuropathic pain. Cannabis is 3rd line. So in an evidence-based society where we've actually got over the hill that this is cannabis, they actually put it in the categories of where it's appropriate to use it. And cannabis should be a 3rd line treatment in Canada, so you'd use that before you use methadone. But in hard drugs like methadone, digressing, getting back to it, a GP would never really feel comfortable starting out prescribing methadone for a patient. But once the pain clinic has got them sorted and got them on a balanced dose, then the GP will keep doing the scripts for years and years as required. So we really want to shoehorn this into the medical system. Some of them want to throw it into complementary and alternative medicines. We've got some other ideas too. We think nurse practitioners, if it's in their field of scope, considering the safety profile of cannabis, that nurse practitioners should be able to prescribe, and that would have huge benefits at the hospice and for palliative care for legal access as well. Just having more prescribers and encouraging them to actually develop their knowledge on the topic. Because we have a handful of specialists in New Zealand who are already starting to aggressively dish it out. But we've got a whole lot of GPs in particular who are just telling their patients porkies about the legality of their prescribing CBD. We've got prescribers who are lying to their patients at the moment, even when they can prescribe it. And there's such a lack of knowledge there that when I've been advocating for patients with these near-pharmaceutical products in Canada, I'm telling neurologists how to actually prescribe the stuff. So we've got this issue where a lot of the patients know more than some of the medical professionals. And it's got to stop, and we've got to do something with this bill to fix all of that.
Questions?
Thank you. Very good submission. You're like a walking encyclopedia.
I have wanted to button on just about every question you've asked.
So, knowledge is good, but we're working in a system, and I suppose, it's Parliament and it's politics. You've got to take people with you. I once heard a minister say they thought the hardest thing would be coming up with policy ideas, but they realised quickly that was easy. It was getting it through the House and getting support so it came into law. So where I'm getting at is, why stubbornly hold on to the kind of the grow your own, the loose leaf argument? Why not? Because I tell you what, I shouldn't say no one, that's exaggerating. The majority of people in the electorate I represent, the Waimakariri area, don't want people growing cannabis for whatever reason. So perception, that fear is perception, but it's reality. Whatever's perceived as reality. Why not park that and just stick with the CBD? Because that seems to be the strongest argument.
The CBD is overhyped. For epilepsy, they developed pure CBD for epilepsy for political purposes. And the doses required when you're using pure CBD are orders of magnitude larger than if you're using a high CBD product. So if we refer to the other annex, and we've got the sliding scale of potencies, the high CBD products that are about a 1 to 20 ratio, where you get a little bit of THC and a lot of CBD, you need orders of magnitude less medicine to get the same effect, which has a direct bearing on parents being able to afford a few $1,000s a year versus $50,000 to $100,000 a year for pure CBD. And that's for the one without trials. When the Epidiolex product for the trials comes in, you're talking $200K a year for a teenager for epilepsy. And I don't see pharma going to be dishing out $200K for a kid who has a high chance of dying anyway. So if we didn't mention grow your own, which is what our patients want, we're probably doing a disservice to the patients. If you don't have the appetite to do that now, I would suggest having the regulatory system look at the possibility of licensing patients, but then pegging that to the referendum or something further down the track. But at least look at it, because it's working in Canada. There is a bit of diversion in every country. But to be honest, in a country that's now has a pea epidemic, if we could swap out half the pea for half the cannabis, that would not be a bad thing anyway. Looking at the harms of cannabis, and this is going way out of the scope of us as a charity, a lot of the Class C drugs are actually safer than alcohol. So we've got a really big issue there. We're worrying about diverting stuff when we can go down and buy alcohol in the grocery store.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. In terms of the home grower, what are the unintentional consequences that you consider?
There's always a risk of diversion. However, if we keep it restricted to those that are severe and debilitating, that medicine's a lifeline, and I don't see those people, if it's given to them as a privilege, I don't see them selling ounces on the street when that's 2 weeks worth of pain relief for them. If we keep it to the very severe patients, I don't think there's going to be much risk of that. Now, if you give it to those with more mild conditions, which is what happens in Colorado and that, and I've got a sore back and I'm a mid-20s white guy, then yeah, there's a risk. However, if we keep it to those that are really sick, those with MS, and those that are ended up on oxy and methadone for severe chronic pain, it's a negligible risk, I'd say. Most patients would hoard it all for themselves. There's no risk of it going out into the wild.
And the safety?
Well, I have differing opinions to some of the others. There is risks with psychosis. However, at a population level, the countries that use the most cannabis don't have the most psychosis. It doesn't create it, but with those that are prone to it, it comes on earlier and it comes on stronger and there's more severe effects. But they've actually already isolated 2 genes for that, ATK1 and COMT1. There's 2 genes that one day you'll be able to take a pinprick blood test and say cannabis isn't right for you. That's still 5 to 10 years away. But yeah, when we talk about cannabis use disorder, it's the official number is about 9%. And for most people with cannabis use disorder, the extension is as much like abstaining from coffee if you're having 5 a day. You wake up in the morning, you're irritable, it's hard to get sleep at night, that sort of thing. It's only a small group of those patients who have really severe problems. And in my field, I'm seeing patients that have been diagnosed with things that they don't have, such as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is a cyclic vomiting syndrome. It's very real, and I know of 5 people who have been told they have it, but only 1 actually had it. It was just a dumping diagnosis by emergency department doctors. So a lot of these numbers are all over the place.